Marie and the coastal sea, aquatic life and everything in between. So sit on down and take a seat. Coastal catch-ups with the stampede.
John, thank you very much for coming on to Coastal Catch-Ups.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure, Sam.
It's great
Good
to
to
have
talk to
you. Great to have you. And I think a lot of our listeners will find your stories very interesting. I know speaking to you beforehand, you're very modest, but I think the adventures and all the rest, or the maybe people that haven't experienced those things, it'll be great for them to hear. So if you wouldn't mind, John, just to start, tell us a bit about yourself, your relationship with the coastline, your livelihood, how you've been involved in the coastline, boats, and all the rest.
Okay. Well, so I suppose born and grown up in Belfast, but I started sailing when I was about 10, and from then on, I suppose I spent as much time as possible every summer on or on the shores of Strangford Lough. I just got really into sailing, obsessed, you might say. And so then I moved away from Northern Ireland to go to university in 1978. And to be honest, that was the height of the troubles. And I probably thought I was never going to come back again. But lo and behold, here I am back. Very fortunate to be actually living on the shore of Strangford Lough, which is just fantastic. And now I'm retired. So I suppose in terms of the sailing that I've done, you might say I'm a bit of a jack of all trades. I've done lots of different types of it. But so starting off as a young guy through my teens and my 20s, it was really all about dinghy racing. And then, well, after we got married, I'm married to a sailor, which is very convenient. And we started, when our family came along, we started cruising a little bit with them. But then as they got older and they got into dinghy racing, then we kind of became their support crew for probably about 10 years, going around to events and all that kind of crap. And then more recently, they've gone off and they're doing their own thing. And then we've got back to a bit more cruising. But more recently, actually, we've bought an old wooden day racing boat called a Glen, and we're back to racing again. So we've kind of gone full circle. And the Glen, interestingly, the Glen is the boat that Heather's dad used to race when he was a young man, and we're doing it at the club that Heather grew up in as a kid as well. So things go round.
So sailing has basically just been in your blood since you were a nipper, basically, and it's just continued.
It wasn't, my parents didn't sail anything, but my elder sister started, and my brother independently started sailing. They're both a bit older than me, and so I started crewing for them a wee bit. But then very quickly, I suppose I became much more obsessed than they ever did. And I was just reading all the books and just wanted to be on the water anytime I could in the summertime.
Yeah. And the dinghy sailing you were involved in, was it competitive? Was it a bit more relaxed? Did you travel much with that?
Well, it seemed pretty competitive to me. I was pretty competitive. In my teens, I didn't really have the opportunity to travel around very much in the way that maybe people do more now. So the racing was very largely on Strangford Lough. But then I suppose as I went into my 20s, and by that stage I was living in England, I used to do a little bit like the stuff that you do now, Sam. I would go to national championships in dinghies around the coast and come back wrecked like you are now.
Gotta recover. A week in Cornwall sailing in heavy winds does that to the person. In terms of actually, I wanted to ask you, comparing this dinghy sailing to what it's like now compared to when you started off, I take it the sport is growing, and because you always hear stories about fleets of boats appearing and then disappearing. You mentioned about the Glen, and its longevity has actually been quite good, but some fleets have disappeared and then others emerge. But overall, do you think the actual sport of sailing's growing around our coastline, or do you think it's decreased in a way?
I don't have any facts and figures.
Yeah.
I think dinghy sailing has declined definitely from
Right.
when I was young. And but there are an awful lot more bigger cruisers around. So a lot of which tend to just sit in marinas maybe, but I mean when I was growing up at East Down Yacht Club, just down the coast from where I am now, the biggest boat there was 35 feet long, and it seemed huge. Nowadays, when people are buying their first boat, a lot of people are buying a bigger boat than that. It's kind of a bit mad, really. Maybe it's people are more affluent. I'm not really quite sure what it is, but no, I mean, dinghy sailing is not as big as it was, which is a bit disappointing for somebody like me. But like all sports, the racing side of it has become much more professionalized than it ever was. So, you know, when I was your age, it was really all pretty amateur. Whereas now, as you know, there's all sorts of squads and training camps and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, you debate whether that's better or worse, but it's certainly different.
Yeah. And I think dinghy sailing as well is good in the sense that, say at a young age you're in a small boat and you learn the basics of sailing, it kind of doesn't leave you. You know the bit. It's like riding a bike. It stays with you, and then if you do, like see yourself going to cruising, at least you know, pardon the pun, you know the ropes, and it kind of just teaches you the basics. And I think as well, dinghy sailing, for me, it taught me a lot of valuable lessons, as in look after your stuff. Now, if my mum's listening, she'd probably disagree with this and say he left stuff at his ass all the time. But it kind of, if you look at like, it kind of taught me a lot of things. And when I was looking back on it, probably at the time I didn't realize, but looking back on it, probably taught me a lot of things about looking after your stuff, being on time, stuff, just like wee small things like that, which you maybe didn't appreciate at the time. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And for our three children, going through the various, you know, racing squads that they were in, it taught them to be quite sort of self-disciplined, I suppose, because they had their sailing to do, and then they had to fit in their schoolwork and whatever other land-based training maybe as well. I mean, I can remember dropping Robbie up to a gym on the Falls Road at kind of 6:30 in the morning to do a workout before he then went to school to do his A-level stuff, you know. So sure, I mean that's good stuff for life lessons for sure.
Yeah. But here we're not here to talk about life lessons, Sean. We're talking about sailing. So
yeah, absolutely. Still getting a bit heavy, Sam.
Yeah, I know. So you're after the dinghy sailing, you mentioned you did a bit of cruising. Maybe was it with Laura and Peter, your two kids? You had
well, so well, I've kind of done a couple of big cruises, a couple of transatlantic circuits, about 30 years apart, and then in between all of that, I've done a wee bit of local cruising, but I suppose those are the two big bits of cruising that I've done. And I mean, coming back to your point about dinghies teaching you how to sail, the sailing is the easy bit really when you're doing something like that. The hard bit is, for me anyway, is how does the blooming engine work? How do you fix the electronics? What do you do when a sail gets ripped and your nearest sailmaker is hundreds of miles away? What do you do when the toilet's blocked? So cruising, there are all sorts of other skills that you have to develop in order to be fairly self-sufficient, particularly when you're doing blue water cruising, when you're going a long way from home. And that's something I don't think I fully appreciated the first time I went out.
Yeah. So what was your first longest voyage? Talk us through that.
Okay, so I was 31. I had been living in London, and for a variety of reasons, I wanted to run away from it all. So I bought the biggest boat I could afford, which was a sort of 34-foot, 10-year-old bog standard sort of a cruiser, really, I suppose. And I set off. Key thing, I suppose, that my pal who I'd raced with at university in dinghies had done a wee bit of cruising, and he was keen to take 3 months off work. I had just quit my job, and I was just going indefinitely. But I figured out that 3 months would be long enough to get us from England to the Caribbean, and hopefully by then I would know what I was doing a bit better. Because before that, I hadn't. I mean, literally, when we left England, I had never done an overnight passage on a yacht. I'd sailed to Scotland, I'd sailed to the Isle of Man, and just day sailing stuff, So it was a bit daft looking back on it, and a bit foolhardy, but I guess I got away with it because I'm here still, Had a few adventures along the way.
So during that trip, was there anything interesting, or what lessons did you learn? And what anything stand out from in the memory book?
Well, because my pal Roger was tight on time, and there's a particular you want to cross the Atlantic from the Canaries to the Caribbean from December onwards, really, because that's when the winds are good. So we really had to delay our departure from England until October. Now, going across the Bay of Biscay in October is potentially a bit challenging, and it certainly was for us. We got beaten up quite badly, and that's probably the scariest time I've ever had on a boat, where I really felt like, this is out of our hands at this point. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So we were caught in what the BBC said was a force 10 in the middle of the Bay of Biscay in October, with no sails up, ropes out the back of the boat to try to slow us down as we were surfing down these horrendous waves. And as I already said, being pretty blooming inexperienced as well. So that was a real baptism of fire, I suppose. The good news is it got much better after that. So the weather got warmer, the wind got nicer, and from then on we had a pretty good time.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine how scary that would be, especially if being I've been in a storm, and it had nothing near a force 10, mind you, but I remember that even being scary, and did the ropes work when you threw them out the back of the boat, the slow the boat down?
Well, they sort of did. I mean, this was we'd read about this in books, right, Sam? So we read all the books. We knew what we were supposed to do, and all the books back then said that that's what you should do.
Okay.
And so the idea is that it slows you down enough so that you can steer a bit better, and you don't just get spun around by the waves. But I mean, we did at one point broach so over onto our side, and I didn't mention I'd also conned my brother into coming with us for the first 3 weeks, I told him, Ted, we're going to take you down to Madeira and it'll be great fun. And Ted isn't really a sailor, so he was down below. We'd shut all the hatches to, in case we did get broached and have water coming in. So all the hatches were shut. Roger and I were tied on in the cockpit when we broached, and Ted was down below. So we came back up again, and everything was broadly intact. There were a few things bent, but we were still had a mast and all that. And I kind of hammered on the hatch, said, "Ted, you all right?" And Ted sort of shouted back, "Yeah, I'm fine." But we didn't open the hatch because we were still scared about water getting in, until probably a couple of hours later, when we finally reckoned that conditions were such that it was safe to open the hatch. We opened the hatch, and Ted poked his head out with this huge bandage wrapped around his head. He looked like somebody that had come from the Somme, And so he'd been flung across the cabin when we broached, and kind of bashed his head off the chart table, bled all over the chart, and but then patched himself together. But I mean, we laugh about it now, but again, that could have been very bad because we were well out of range of any help from anybody at that point.
Yeah.
Look, I don't want to paint this sort of horrendous picture, because if I have one message probably for people who are thinking of going cruising, is just go, because it's not that hard as long as you're reasonably sensible. And yeah, okay, stuff goes wrong, but stuff, it's generally not desperate. And for all the pluses that you get from it, it's really, really worth it. That's what I would say. There's a great book called Ocean Cruising Countdown. Now I think it might be out of print now, but it's still on Amazon. And I read it before that trip, and its basic message is, look, if you wait until you have all the experience and the perfect boat, it'll never happen. You just won't do it. So there's always going to be a bit of a leap of faith if you're going to have a wee bit of an adventure like that. And sure, you're managing the risks as best you can, but you've got to stick your neck out at some point. But I mean, maybe that's kind of follows up to follow on from that. Then, so we did another. I did another transatlantic circuit just 5 years ago now, I think it is, with my wife Heather and with our daughter Laura and son Peter. And unfortunately, Robbie, our eldest, was a working man at that point, so he missed out. But the other two, one of them had just finished A-levels, one of them had just finished university. So they both took gap years and came with Heather and I, and that was brilliant. But in terms of that whole risk management thing, I definitely felt a lot more responsibility the second time round, and was a lot more risk averse, let's say, in the way that I did things.
Yeah, it's different when you have kids on board that you're responsible for, definitely. So how was that sailing as a family? Like, you all made it back, so you didn't fall out, I see. And
well, we're still talking to each other, yeah. Before we went, Peter, we had a discussion about what might annoy us each about the other, so that we could try to manage that, because it's like, for people that don't know what it's like, it's a wee bit like being in a small touring caravan, except you're in a small touring caravan that might be hundreds of miles offshore, and you've got nowhere, you can't get off and go and get your head charged. You're stuck. So it is important that you don't wind each other up. And I mean, one of the things that Peter said was, please, I don't want to see you, Dad, or Mum naked. So we did our best to avoid that. even though it was very hot at times.
I remember
But
being on the boat, John, and there wasn't too many. Was it curtains or was it? There wasn't that many
yeah,
doors.
there are no doors on this boat at all. Just curtains, or a few curtains, which.
Yeah.
So yeah, nowhere to hide.
So,
But sorry, go on.
sorry, going ahead, John. Sorry, going ahead.
No. I mean, it was great. It wasn't always easy for everybody. You know, everybody has their tough times in the course of what 10 months, I think. But you know, I think we've all come back glad for the experience, glad for the adventure, and glad to seeing the places that we saw and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Not many people, yeah, get that opportunity, especially to do it with loved ones. So I think you're all very fortunate, and it's great. It's great to hear about it. I think people like hearing about it as well. So from that trip, any standout moments? How long was the crossing? Actually, was it 3 weeks from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean?
Yeah, about that. I don't remember
Yeah.
the exact number of days, but about that. Well, I suppose in terms of the actual crossing, one of the things that stands out very much for me is you've heard of sargassum weed, which is this kind of floating algae, but it's basically to you and I, or to most of us, it's seaweed, but it's floating seaweed in the middle of the ocean. Now, the first time that I went across the Atlantic, there's an area called Sargasso Sea, which is where traditionally you would find some of that stuff. And first time round, 30 odd years ago, there were wee patches of it that we sailed through for maybe about a week. And it was quite interesting, and that was all.
Mm-hmm.
This time around, 2018, 2019, there were like fields of this stuff. I can't emphasize enough how much sargassum weed there is in the middle of the Atlantic at the moment. And I looked it up today actually before we chatted, and I think it's even worse now than it was. So whether that is, I think, you know, it's speculated that it's to do with pollution, you know, maybe agricultural runoff of nutrients and so on into the water, or obviously the warming of the water is potentially another factor. But from a sailor's perspective, it's a pain in the ass because, you know, it clogs up your rudders and slows you down, and you have to stop and clear your rudders and all that sort of stuff. But for the people in the Caribbean and, you know, around the shores of that whole area, it's a much more serious problem, because this stuff is piling up on the windward shores, because, you know, you've got the trade winds that basically blow from east to west across that part of the Atlantic. So everything piles up on their eastern shores of the islands and of the mainland of Central America.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it rots, it stinks, it's bad for tourism, it's bad for fishermen because it fills up their nets and clogs up their nets. And it amazes me that there hasn't been more about it on the general news, because it's just one of those really.
Yeah, because when you mentioned that before we chatted, I looked it up myself as well. And when I was reading about it, I think it was an article on the Guardian or something. But yeah, it seems to be a lot worse from climate change and nutrients from agricultural runoff. But it struck home because it's not this. It's obviously at a larger scale of what's happening here. We have the same problem around here on our coast with algal blooms, and you'll hear the blue-green algae and stuff like that. Kind of similar concept. And then when you have this stuff coming on the shore, yeah, like you say, stinks, tourism's impacted. It actually reduces photosynthesis. Any vegetation under that normally has nice light hitting it, and it can photosynthesize. And I assume we don't know about it because we're not really over that part of the world much from here. And it's just, but
Yeah. but I suppose it's what was a bit frightening really was that there could have been that amount of human-induced change in an area so vast as the North Atlantic Ocean. But you could equally talk about the amount of plastic pollution that we saw compared to before, and on the shores of Strangford Lough, even, which the amount of plastic you see is really quite depressing.
Yeah, I think you have a good point there about when these problems are offshore. I'm thinking of like the Pacific garbage patch, which you read about in newsletters, but very few people will see. This problem is offshore. Very few people will see it. Like see yourself seeing the sargassum patches. Very few people will see. So maybe this is why we're doing this podcast, John. Just raising awareness of these issues, and but yeah, I think you're right. The human-induced activity that is causing all this as well. Well, you can go off in a whole different story. But it's interesting from your perspective as well. You've done that a couple years separating these two trips, and you can see the difference as well. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, one more sort of gloomy climate change thing, and then perhaps we can move on to some cheerful stuff. But the other thing that just scares the bejesus out of me, it was in the news in the last week or so, was the rise in global ocean temperatures. And I'm sure you've seen that, where we've just completely bust the records for the average temperature. And I suppose with my kind of slightly mathematical head on it, I find that much scarier than a news item about a forest fire or a tropical downpour or something like that, because it's all these data points across the entirety of the globe, I think it's from 60 degrees north to 60 degrees south. The average of all of that has just jumped right out of the norm. That is really alarming, and
when you think of the scale of the ocean and how much it takes to cause that average, something big is happening. And like we've seen that marine heat wave around the UK at the minute. So it's frightening, but I think I don't know what else to, unless we go down a rabbit hole here, John. I don't know where else to talk.
Well, I just think people need to catch. We all need to catch ourselves on, really, don't we? And about everybody trying to do something, and trying to influence governments probably is the most important thing.
Yeah, there's so many interesting projects, because I was talking to Dr. Rachel Miller in the last episode. She's working for Ulster Wildlife, and there's so many interesting projects because these changes are happening right now. There's projects trying to help species and habitats actually adapt to all these changes, because that's that is part of the biodiversity crisis. These species cannot keep up with the rapid change in the climate and their environment. So there's loads of interesting projects and research going into that. So it's one just to keep making awareness of it, and and I'm sure I'll get plenty of other guests on here to talk about that. But the rest of the trip then, John, in the Caribbean, was there any other standout moments when you got there after your adventure? You could relax a bit, you could take everything in. Anything else?
Well, funny, a lot of the places that I remembered very fondly from first time round weren't so good second time round. So there's a lesson: don't go back to the but then there were lots of places that were fantastic. We probably went a bit more off the beaten track. So because actually, some of the classic places like the Tobago Keys, for example, there are just so many boats there now. and that was certainly a change. But so we went down to the bigger islands, so to Jamaica and to Cuba, which most boats don't go to. And well, actually, I suppose on the way to there, one of the standout moments, again, not in a particularly good way, was that we were sailing from the Virgin Islands to an island off Haiti, and so it was about a 5-night trip, something like that, about 4 or 5 night trip, and kind of halfway into it, so we're in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, long way from anywhere really, but we're close enough to the South American coast that I'm a little bit conscious that in Venezuela there have been issues of piracy. So that's kind of the background. We're sailing along in the middle of the night. Laura is on watch on her own, and we're sailing downwind with the spinnaker up. Suddenly she shouts to me. Now, she might have been in normal times, she might have been saying, "Dad, it's your turn to get on watch." But the way she was calling, I could tell it wasn't Dad. So anyway, I came up on deck, and the first thing I saw was a bow wave and a bright light coming towards us very quickly. And so the first thing that goes through your head is, "Oh shit! It's a ship that we're somehow not seen." But then it was clear that it wasn't actually a ship. There was something smaller and faster coming in, and it turned out to be a big rib. And then when it came alongside, the next thing we saw was that there were guys with machine guns pointing at us. So you can just imagine what that was like for Laura and for me. And then, so I'll cut a long story short. It actually turned out that it was the US Coast Guard. And the US Coast Guard then cross-examined us at gunpoint for, it might have been 20 minutes. And I just got more and more cross about the whole situation because, as far as I'm aware, they have zero jurisdiction in that part of the world. We were in international waters. I presume they're there for drug interception or whatever, but it was patently obvious that we were not doing that. We had our AIS on, so they could see, we were broadcasting who we were. I'm quite sure they were able to look up the computer records to see that we'd left British Virgin Islands a few days earlier, all that sort of stuff. But anyway, we went through a whole malarkey of questioning with them, and then eventually I kind of lost my temper and said, "Right, we're going now," and so they kind of broke off contact with us with "Have a nice day," and then suddenly the lights came on of their mothership, which had obviously been tracking us with no lights on and no identification on, but close by, and they kind of roared back to their mothership. But that was really, really scary. I mean, that was far scarier than any bad weather that we were in the whole year. It was just horrendous, and it took me a long time to get over my anger at what they had done, because I think they were just using us as a training exercise, really.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't imagine in the moment, especially when you mentioned when you first saw the light, almost the feeling of, have we missed something here? Have we missed a ship coming towards us? Which, it would be the end, more or less. In that moment, John, how did you, between the adrenaline, the frustration, the anger, how did you actually manage to function? That's what I wanted to ask.
Well, I don't have much experience with people pointing guns at me, thankfully.
Yeah.
So initially, I think I was just being very compliant and trying to answer their questions.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, it was really only as it went on that I became more and more frustrated with it.
Mm-hmm.
If I'd had my wits about me, I remember I'd been woken up at 2 a.m. or something. But if it had my wits about me a bit more, I might have said, "Look, who the hell do you think you are? And what rights do you have to be doing this to us right now?" But I didn't.
Mm-hmm. It's hard when you have guns pointed at you, I suppose.
Well, in my experience, yeah, it is.
Oh dear. Well, yeah, no.
But that was an isolated, weird
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
But as I mentioned, we were on our way to a place called Île-à-Vache, which is an island. It's part of Haiti, just off the coast of Haiti. And having been in the Virgin Islands, which is really quite Western and affluent, again, as I'm sure you know, Haiti is just in a desperate state. And we sailed into the bay on this island, and people were coming out to us in dugout canoes, and they had nothing. I mean, really nothing. So that was very humbling and a real kind of reality check, I suppose. But very interesting as well to have the opportunity to meet those people and spend some time with them.
The communities there have been through a lot between hurricanes and then rebuilding, never mind probably not even having the resources to rebuild. So
yeah. Well, they were fishing in kind of beat up boats with rags for sails, really. And so we gave them what we could, if you like, in terms of whatever, but not very much.
Yeah.
Anyway, but it was really interesting, and then sort of moving on from that, we spent a month in Cuba, which was fantastic, because Cuba is still, I suppose, opening up as a holiday destination, but it's a really big island, and there are bits that you're able to sail to that you can't get to as an ordinary tourist, and so that was fascinating and beautiful, really beautiful. So there were lots of. I feel like we're dwelling on all the bad things, but actually there were lots of really fantastic things in the trip.
Yeah, I know that's the problem, John. The bad things make the good stories. That
makes the news, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's it. No, and I think I know what you mean. We've dwelled on the stories, but I think yeah, it's fascinating for your experience and doing it with your family. So all these adventures, all these stories, you're at Strangford Lough at the minute, and you have a Glen. Tell us a bit about that. Is that been, how long have you owned the Glen for?
Well, so we came back into Strangford Lough, and maybe I'd just say, for me, one of the best feelings is coming back into Strangford Lough from being away cruising, because the sea is lumpy and wavy and uncomfortable, and then you come in past Angus Rock and into the Narrows, and suddenly everything goes flat, and then it opens up into this beautiful place that is Strangford Lough, and you just think, wow, and we're home, and it's lovely. But so the Glen is a class of boats that were built just shortly after the Second World War in Bangor, and there are about a dozen that are sort of in commission, if you like, in Strangford Lough, and there's a similar number down in Dunleary, and then there are one or two dotted around in all sorts of funny places. But they're just nice. They're just nicely wooden day racing boats. So they do sort of notionally have cabins, but I certainly wouldn't want to be spending a night in one. And we have great close racing amongst the people that have them here in the Lough. And that's it's just fun. It's just fun. And one of the things about sailing, I suppose, is that you can do lots of different types of sailing. So you can do the hardcore dinghy racing like you do now, or you can do gentle cruising, potter over to the Isle of Man. You can, or you can be slightly more adventurous, or you can do the slightly longer stuff that we've been talking a lot about. Or as you get on in years, you can come back and race other boats that are slightly less physically demanding, but still a lot of fun. So I think as a sport, it's great from that point of view.
No, I think you're absolutely spot on, John. So if anyone's listening, would you and they're not a sailor, would you recommend them getting into sailing? Or would you say, no, stay away? Owning a boat, it's a nightmare.
No, of course, I would say get into sailing because I love it. But clearly it's not for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I get scared up mountains, and so it's horses for courses, I suppose. Mm-hmm. I can't honestly put my finger on what it is that has made it such a passion for me throughout my life. Mm-hmm. I mean, I do love the space, when you're on the water, the surroundings. But then people say they get that from a game of golf as well. So I don't know. Yeah. I love the fact that it's never the same. 2 days are never the same. The wind's different, the tide's different. I love waking up and looking out of the window here at Strangford Lough every day, and I just think, wow, it's fantastic. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would definitely encourage people to try sailing, but equally, there are lots of different ways of getting on the water, and I do think that, if you want to do paddle boarding, you want to do canoeing, to me that's all great too. I would encourage that too.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. It's not just about sailing as well. It's lots of stuff you can do on the water. So, and I think for me as well, whatever it is you're doing on the water, I can't multitask. So if I'm focusing on one thing, I forget about all the other problems in my life. And just trying to sail a boat, make it move. That's a problem at that very moment, and just focus on that and switch off. So yeah. Listen, John, I think that I'll end our chat here, but I just want to say thank you very much for your time. And it's been great to hear about your stories. And I love the comparison from your first trips to the more recent ones, and your observations around the Caribbean. And also now you're nicely settled in Strangford Lough with a nice wooden boat, and you're not going to take out the Caribbean, so I look forward to seeing on the water.
Hope to say that for a few years to come. Yeah,
absolutely. Mm-hmm. So thank you, John. Thanks again, and catch you soon.
Really nice to talk to you, Sam.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you so much for listening to the most recent episode there with John Gilmore. For me, the most interesting thing of that chat was the difference John noticed between his trips from the Caribbean, his first one to his last one, the changes he noticed in the landscape around the area. That includes the sargassum weed fields that have grown significantly due to climate change and agricultural runoff. So it was really interesting to get a first-hand experience from John on all these issues that we may not see in the news all the time. So it's really great to talk about them and raise awareness. Just one thing before I go, I would really appreciate if whatever platform you're listening to Coastal Catch-Ups on, if you could like, share, review the podcast. It'll really help spread the message and get the podcast out there, which I would really, really appreciate. So thank you. And in addition to that, if you want to stay up to date with the episodes, you can subscribe to our email newsletter on the website. So check that out if you want to stay up to date. So that's everything. Thank you very much, and I'll see you on the next episode.
It's all about Marie and the coastal sea, aquatic life and everything in between. So sit on down and take a seat. Coastal catch-ups with the stampede.